So what can we do about this? There are several alternatives. They fall into two general categories: actions at the federal level and actions at the state level. There are three basic federal level solutions, all of which have at their core that government should issue and control the quantity of money, and commercial banks can only lend out the money they actually have. British citizen James Robertson splits up the money power between two competing governmental bodies. The British government would publish monetary objectives approved by Parliament, for example, an inflation range of 2 to 3%. Then the Bank of England would create just enough debt-free money to achieve those objectives. It would then give this money to the government to spend into the economy by the normal budgetary process.
This is an agency of society. It's a public agency acting in the public interest. And it's acting in the public interest to achieve objectives given to it by the elected government. It should be at professional arm's length from the elected people themselves, because the legislators are going to try and get as much money as they can into their local economy. And if it's a question of a national election, they will want to manipulate decisions about the money supply in favour of keeping them in power. That seems to me, you can't ignore that fact. It's a fact of life.
Commercial banks would still be in operation, but could only lend out the money they have. Then they would have to compete for additional money on the open market, just as other corporations have to compete in the market to buy the materials they use. Lending out extra money that a bank didn't have would be considered a form of counterfeiting.
They would be prohibited from creating new money at all. And they would be competing, absolutely competing without subsidy, as they have now, competing with other banks to provide a better deal. Right. And what this would do, it would make the banks truly competitive, which they're certainly not at the moment. They're about the only huge industry that is subsidized to the level that they are. And also, a competitive market for borrowing and lending would encourage new entrants to come in, much more than they can get in now, when the existing licensed banks are so highly subsidized by the permission that they are given to create new money.
Right. In other words, banks could only lend money they actually had.
Absolutely. And I think that that's the situation that the Central Monetary Authority should be in. It should create the money debt-free, and it should give it to the government to spend into circulation.
In Ellen Brown's solution, the government would create all the money debt-free.
The solution to all this is to return to the government-issued money of the American colonists, and particularly the colony of Pennsylvania, which had its own bank. Congress feels that they have to bail out the banking system, and the real reason is that we think that we're dependent on this banking system for our credit, but we're not. Like Dorothy and all the characters in The Wizard of Oz, we have the power to create our own money. The government's mentality in general seems to be, we'll do what we have to do and we'll worry about paying for it later. But what you could do is pay for it now. In other words, you don't have to pay for it later. You don't have to pay for it with debt. You can just pay for it with money.
In the Money Master's solution, the government creates all the money in the form of debt-free U.S. notes, or their electronic equivalents, and then spends that money into existence through the normal budgetary process. Existing money is, of course, replaced one for one with the new debt-free money. The national debt is paid off with this new money as well, but to prevent inflation, reserve requirements are gradually raised on the commercial banks, requiring them to maintain 100% reserves. In other words, banks could then only loan out money they actually have.
I think that the solution is what I call $1 of capital, which is simply that you have to have $1 of capital against every unsecured asset you lend against. So if you're going to loan against credit card, you have to have $1 capital for every dollar that's outstanding in balance. If you're going to write loans against houses or against cars, you can write all the loans you want against the value of that asset, whatever that is. And as long as you do that, there's never a banking safety and soundness issue.
Solutions at the state level will be easier to achieve initially before reform at the federal level is politically possible. An interesting fact is you don't have to have a federal charter to create a bank. States can charter banks as well. All it takes is a bill passed by the state legislature. Many states already allow state-chartered banks. The state then deposits all their funds into their new bank and can then utilize the fractional reserve principle to their advantage by making loans to themselves for roads, bridges, etc. at no interest. When the loans are repaid, the money is extinguished from the system. The beauty of this system is you create wealth without creating a permanent increase in the money supply and the consequent inflation.
During the Civil War, Virginia authorized counties to issue their own debt-free money. Since there was no gold, there would have been no money in circulation to maintain commerce. These surviving bills are tissue paper thin.
Minnesota monetary reform expert Byron Dale has proposed legislation for Minnesota to charter a state bank which would be empowered to give the state government all the money necessary to provide infrastructure funding such as road building and repair without debt or interest.
My concept of money reform is just a little bit different, but it's only based upon the fact that for me personally, it's easier to work on my state legislators than it is my federal legislators. And of course, the solution to our problem is clearly money put into circulation without debt. Now, it really doesn't make any difference how you do it. It just as long as the money comes into circulation without a debt to anybody and as a payment. The very concept of the bill is to simply have the banks create the money and spend it into circulation to build the infrastructure for the state.
This proposal is currently working its way through the Minnesota legislature with several bankers as sponsors. Actually, the state-owned bank idea is nothing new. The Bank of North Dakota is the only state-owned bank in America. It was created in 1919 as a populist movement swept through the debt-ridden farmers of the Northern Plains. Even in these worst of times, the Bank of North Dakota is earning record profits and helping fund their state. It's been doing this for the last 90 years, hardly a radical startup idea. According to the bank's president, Eric Hardmeyer,
we are the depository for all state tax collections and fees. We plow those deposits back into the state in the form of low-interest loans. Over the last 10 to 12 years, we've turned back $1/3 of $1 billion just to general fund to offset taxes or to aid in funding public sector needs. Not bad for a state with a population of 600,000. In 2009, the state of North Dakota does not have any funding issues at all. We, in fact, are dealing with the largest surplus we've ever had.
Interestingly, the Bank of North Dakota idea was initiated by a group of Swedish immigrants to North Dakota in the early 1900s. Community banking had been going on in Sweden for at least a century before that. Around 1820, the Swedes came up with the idea of the savings bank.
These full reserve banks only lent out money they actually had. They decentralized the money power and were encouraged by the government as a way for municipalities to fight poverty.
These operated on what was known as the church steeple principle, where the bank could only make loans to customers whose houses could be seen from the highest church steeple in town.
These community banks increased the commonwealth instead of the big bankers' wealth. This helped Sweden grow rich, which helped Stockholm
to grow into the magnificent Venice of Scandinavia that we see here today. But then the debt-based bankers attacked the savings banks.
They first convinced most of them to consolidate into bigger and bigger banks. Then the Swedish Parliament was convinced to pass a law allowing the non-profit savings banks to be bought up by the commercial banks. After a series of mergers, these banks are now called Swedbank.
They were under a severe attack during the 80s, but many of the saving banks still remain in the country. And they are very effective, and especially because they decentralize the power and give it back into the hands of the citizens. They empower the local communities. And in times of crisis, they have proven to be more profitable than the big banks.
Now there are only about 50 savings banks left, a small remnant of a great idea for publicly owned banking that shows that communities or even nations can operate debt-free.
Iceland's tiny economy and sparse resources were also nurtured by a series of public interest savings banks. Despite a population of a little over 300,000 people and a gross domestic product of around only $12 billion, Iceland is one of the most civilized nations on earth. But then the government privatized the savings banks, similar to the Swedish savings banks 20 years earlier. But in Iceland's case, even the Landsbanken, which essentially was the Bank of Iceland, was privatized as well. For the first few years, things looked good. The economy doubled. But under the surface, the private bankers were creating a huge financial bubble. They opened a new offshore internet bank called IceSave, targeting depositors in the UK and Holland by offering attractive interest rates for new depositors. Hundreds of thousands of new accounts were opened. Entire towns and police department pension funds put their money into IceSave, as did charities such as cancer relief funds. Using fractional reserve lending, IceSave fanned that into billions for questionable new loans. IceSave started investing in European ventures, especially in Russia. Many now believe that IceSave actually became a money laundering operation for the Russian mafia. All the while trading on the good reputation for solid banking Iceland had built up over the previous decades.
However, when the bank was privatized, it still used the good reputation of Iceland to grow huge and do, lots of criminal activities. And the owner, Björgólfur Thor, he became one of the rich boys in the world really quickly, one of the billionaires. I've seen documents linking him to the Russian mafia and his father. One oligarch that fled to the UK confirmed that Iceland was used as a money laundering machine for the Russian mafia.
When the crash came in 2008, the big Icelandic banks quickly failed.
In the 5 years' time they were privatized before the collapse, they actually grew 10 times the Icelandic GDP. And when it collapsed, you can imagine how huge the collapse was, because they collapsed onto the shoulders of the nation or the taxpayers.
The Icelandic parliament at first poured enormous amounts of taxpayer money into them to try to save them, but they still failed. Then the government bailed out all the Icelandic depositors, but the IceSave accounts were not in Iceland and were never insured by the Icelandic government, and so they were not bailed out. However, in the face of tremendous political pressure at home, the British and Dutch governments bailed out the IceSave accounts of their citizens, and then tried to make Iceland pay for it at terms that have decimated Iceland's fragile economy.
The income tax of more than half of the nation, just the interest of this particular loan. Then you have other loans, then we would have gotten from, in 2007, being the most developed nation in the world, into a nation spending all its GDP just paying interest of foreign loans.
Inflation shot up. Icelanders soon discovered that even the principal on their home mortgage loans was indexed to inflation. Many Icelanders saw the principal on their home mortgages double and their payments triple. This despite rising unemployment.
The way the loan system is in Iceland is completely outrageous. I mean, it is, your rights as a consumer are zero.
Foreclosures mounted and the citizens rioted. They call it their revolution. They stormed the Parliament Square. The president was forced to call for a referendum. 93% of the people voted not to bail out the bankers.
The Brits aren't exactly a shining light here about how to handle international relations. It's one of the worst conducted, most absurd things I've seen in a long time, really. I mean, it's obvious that the Icelandics cannot afford to pay this money back. What we've just seen is the first anti-bailout tax revolt here.
Now the ruling party is trying to convince Iceland to join the European Union to be eligible for loans to save its economy. The people, however, seem unconvinced that more and more debt is the solution. Iceland now seems determined to take back their money power and not take on more national debt.
What I want to implement here is a healthy banking system where you don't have fractional reserve, you don't have high interest. The banks should not serve as mafia outlets. It should be something that is important for the communities.
Over 70% of Iceland now opposes joining the EU, and some are now supporting proposals for cities to start up savings banks based on the Bank of North Dakota model to provide local credit and stop the rising wave of housing foreclosures.
We're not part of EU yet. They are trying to put us in it with 70% of Icelanders don't want to join the EU, but the Social Democrats are in power, and that is their sole mission, to get Iceland into the EU.
Iceland is proud of its democratic heritage. Iceland is the home of the oldest parliament in Europe, having met annually for over 1,000 years. For the first 800 years, the Icelandic parliament met at this site, where the North American tectonic plate meets the European plate. Called Þingvellir, Icelanders consider this a holy site where elected government was born. Today, Iceland is the new battleground as it attempts to become the first nation in modern times to escape the serfdom of the debt money system. If Iceland escapes, the rest of the world will be watching.
If you end up paying this money, entering into the EU to try to find salvation that way, it will only get worse. What has happened in Iceland is going to happen on a worldwide scale in our lifetime. There won't be enough money to cover all the debts.
Why are governments pumping money into private banks? Why are they not letting them roll? I mean, just like any other. And then the excuse is, oh, they're too big to fail. Let them fail, please.
So what this all boils down to is whether America, still the freest nation in history, will once again break free of the privately owned central bank as it has 6 times in the past. Our money is not issued by the government, even though they make it look like it is. It doesn't have to be this way. This system has got to go. Some will say, well, those crooks in Congress will create too much money once they get the money power. But Congress now creates all the money at once. It just creates it as debt, which never gets paid back, and which we, the people, have to continually pay interest on. Instead of creating bonds or debt, the government could and should be creating dollars, interest-free.
Even though the federal government is out there borrowing and spending $3 trillion, 10% of GDP, 9.4, something like that, over the last 2 years. Even though they've done that, the total amount of debt outstanding in the system since the beginning of 2008 is actually contracted, including the federal government. And that comes directly off the Federal Reserve's own Z1. Okay? You cannot grow an economy in a debt-based monetary system for real when the outstanding credit is becoming smaller. It can't be done because all money is debt in one form or another. But more importantly, the Treasury could solve this. Treasury has authority to issue non-debt-backed currency. They do it every day, and the quarters that are in your pocket are not debt-backed.
As the inventor of the electric light, Thomas Edison, put it,
if our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers and the other helps the people. Edison was friends with carmaker Henry Ford. Ford understood how the monetary system depended on keeping the average American confused.
It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning.
Under this system, we can never get out of debt. It's just impossible. Nor is gold-backed money the solution. That was the most important symbol in The Wizard of Oz. You think international manipulation is easy now? Just wait until we return to a gold money system.
As Thomas Edison told the New York Times, gold and money are separate things. Gold is the trick mechanism by which you can control money. That is the root of all evil.
The solution is government-issued money. That's the most democratic form of money system. It maximizes freedom in a republic instead of the centralized control of the international plutocracy we are rapidly devolving into. But be prepared to deal with the modern-day gold bugs. Their arguments divert us from the real question.
They say that this money that is created by the state or by society, whatever, is not real money.
Right.
And that it may represent real money, but it isn't real money.
It's not what backs our money. It's who controls its quantity. That's what The Wizard of Oz was all about. Big bankers were controlling the quantity of American money, gold money. Others will say Congress isn't responsive to the people as it is. Well, of course not. Politicians are responsive to those with the power. Right now, the banks have the power. We have to take back the ultimate power of any nation, the power over its money. With the power of banks diminished, politicians will become responsive to the voters once again. If we value the Founding Fathers' dream of freedom and escape from serfdom by political self-determination, we have to conclude that creating our money is too important a function to be put into private hands. History has shown time and time again that leads only to plutocracy, rule by the rich, and ultimately slavery. But what about the banks? They're already failing. Let the big banks fail. No bank is too big to fail. Government can issue its own money. We don't need their hyper-expensive compounding interest system. Don't worry, banks or banking won't go away. You'll still go down to your corner bank to deposit your check. Your bank will still be there. Only the guts, the bank's accounting system, the part you will never see anyway, will change.
At the moment, most of our means of exchange is these electronic digits, which will jump from one bank account to another as we do our business and so on. So there's this cloud of numbers moving about in the economy, which is our means of exchange. Now, where do they come from? They all come into existence when somebody, somewhere, takes out a loan. Every pound circulating, I'm not talking about physical cash in your pocket, I'm talking about the electronic digits, has been borrowed by somebody in the past. So the overall effect of that is that society as a whole, that's us, is actually paying interest to the issuers of these digits for their existence. So the lending and the issuance are stuck together at the moment. I think that's what we want to change. We want to separate that. Put the issuance in the hands of a public body, which will issue the whole of our currency debt-free in the public interest, by the people, for the people, etc. Thereafter, we can lend it to each other, borrow it from each other in the normal way. So for the average person, you won't notice that much difference, except you'll find the whole of society, the whole of economy is a lot better off, because there's not this background draining, siphoning of these money numbers back to the issuers.
It does not mean that the banks will be unable to be prosperous. They would have a slightly different business model than they enjoy now, but not even all the banks have that model today. You have savings and loans, credit unions, loan companies that historically don't create new money, but yet they do intermediate money, they do loan it out, they do take deposits. That would not end. So banks would still have, in my opinion, would have a very prosperous future.
The banks will be businesses like all other businesses, and will have to earn their living through providing valuable services, services which other people are willing to pay for.
All we need in the face of this oncoming first depression of the 21st century is a little education. We can make this the new civil rights movement, the new human rights movement. Nations of the world, the same applies to you. Virtually every nation now labors under the same monetary system. All money is created at interest, as a debt. Once again, we're falling for the bankers' threats of economic collapse, just like when Andrew Jackson tried to kill the Second Bank of the United States. It's nothing but pure extortion, world extortion. Let them fail. Remember, all this money we're giving them is at interest. Money we are borrowing to give to the banks. Then these very same banks have the audacity to loan this money back to us at more interest. This system has got to go.
I think it'll be a very big change. I think it will be actually an essential change, looking to, let's say, the next 100 years or so, in the survival of our species. Absolutely. To get this thing straight.
That's the secret that can set humanity free. Our children won't be saddled with any more national debt. That's right, no more national debt. That term will cease to exist. And don't fall for the argument that those rascals in Congress will spend too much money if they get the power to create money. Look at what they're doing now. They aren't spending it, they're just borrowing it, then giving it away. It can't get any worse. The questions raised by the study of the symbolism embedded in the wonderful Wizard of Oz are even more important when you understand that this is not just an American problem, it's totally international. This privately owned money system is worldwide and is literally the primary cause of most of the world's hunger, poverty, misery, and disease. After William Jennings Bryan's loss in 1896, their cause started weakening. Their ship started to sink. In 1900, L. Frank Baum's wonderful Wizard of Oz was like a desperate flare fired into the night of history, hoping that someone across the centuries would notice, would pay attention to the greatest issue of their era and ultimately ours, humankind's escape from the debt money system. Let's follow the example of Abraham Lincoln when he issued greenbacks in 1862 to save the nation from permanent division.
So before you come up, Bill, I'd just like to say on behalf of the movement, thank you for the work which you've done all these many years. Thank you for producing such entertaining, informative, intellectually captivating and very useful material in your very unique way. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Still.
The global economy continues to crash. Unemployment continues to spiral upwards. Government budgets are tightening dramatically in the wake of the global real estate bubble, a bubble that was specifically caused by banks being in complete control of the money supply instead of sovereign nations being in control of their national currency. That is the basic problem that we're facing, and until this problem is addressed, no amount of national austerity will stop this continuing cascade of negative economic events. England is trying the last thing there is to try. That's to dramatically cut government spending. They call it austerity. But to those of us in this room, we are all acutely aware that this austerity is not going to work. So it's our obligation to be able to say why this is not working and offer a reasonable solution, and we call that solution monetary reform. Monetary reform rests on two great inviolable pillars to me. The first one is that government borrowing must be forbidden. The second one is that banks must stop lending money they do not have. On the first one, the money power, the power to create the national money, is the most important power of a sovereign nation. In fact, it is the very definition of sovereignty. Nations do not have to borrow. Nations can create. The problem is that when a nation borrows from a bank, as Proverbs tells us, the borrower becomes servant to the lender. That is not sovereignty. So what is the result? The nation becomes addicted to the loans, and the banks then have power over it. So you no longer have a sovereign democracy. You have rule by banks. Political science has coined a term for this. It's called plutocracy. This is our primary problem with the economy of every nation today. They have allowed the national debt system to predominate. I say, no more national debt. Let's use the U.S. example today. Mr. Obama has stimulated the economy with about $2 trillion. But here's the problem. He's borrowed the money. So he's borrowed the money mostly from the big banks with interest attached. And then what has he done? He's simply turned around and given this money, given it back to the banks, supposedly to lend to us. What kind of a system is this? It's insane. You couldn't design a worse possible system. Banks must stop lending money they do not have. This, as we all know, is called the fractional reserve lending system. It allows banks not to lend out twice as much money, not 3 times as much money, but 10 to 12 times as much money if they follow the rules. And as we know, with the results of the 2008 debacle, here, at least in the United States, that the big banks were leveraged 50 and 52 to 1. Freddie and Fannie were leveraged 72 to 1. Goldman Sachs was leveraged 333 to 1. And then just about 6 months ago, Mr. Obama gets on TV and says, you know, I think we should just eliminate the reserve requirement altogether. So 333 to 1 is not enough. Only infinity will do. If you or I did this, we would be charged with fraud and or counterfeiting. This fractional reserve system allows the banks to consolidate the wealth of the nation, and that combined with the national debt allows them to use that leverage to control the politics of the nation. So this is a two-pronged problem. When the wealthiest private citizens have control over the money supply, then the government is no longer sovereign. It is no longer the supreme power of the land and can no longer operate in the public interest. Government determined by the citizenry and directed by their elected representatives is still all that stands between us and serfdom. Rule by the rich. In today's world, the democratic aspects of government have been significantly eroded entirely and completely because government has lost these two great pillars of truth. They are borrowing from bankers. They have lost control over the quantity of the national money. Those are the two pillars. This is why we know that no amount of austerity or further government borrowing can possibly fix this problem. This week in England, I met with some wonderful younger folks, you saw one of them just now, who have latched on to these essential truths, both formally within the monetary reform community and last night, up-and-coming students at the London School of Economics. These young, inquiring minds realize that old ways aren't working, that something is very wrong. They can't get jobs the way their parents could just a generation earlier. They are now propelled through both self-interest as well as the normal idealism of young adults to start looking outside the box of their traditional training for something that will work. This is a great force. This is wonderfully encouraging. Now more than ever before, I am convinced that our reforms are inevitable and in the relatively near future. The truth of the manipulation of our money supply can no longer be hidden. These fresh young faces will supply sufficient youthful energy to finally break humanity free of the enslaving shackles of the debt money system. That's all. Any questions?